I was luxuriating in the rare quiet of a Saturday afternoon, savoring the stillness of a day unburdened by the usual work demands. The house was enveloped in a serene silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of a page as I flipped through my novel. Molly, my wife, had gone to take a shower, leaving me to bask in the calm. As I strolled past our bedroom, I noticed her phone resting on the nightstand. Its screen had a soft, intermittent glow, a notification that seemed to be gently summoning my attention. I was about to ignore it, dismissing it as another trivial alert or reminder. But curiosity, that ever-present temptation, got the better of me. I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I did. The screen revealed a voice message from Sam, one of Molly's colleagues. As I pressed play, I heard his voice, smooth and intimate, cutting through the silence of our home. "Hey, Molly. I just wanted to say how much I miss you. It's been hard not having you around. Everything reminds me of you. And it feels like you're always just out of reach." The words felt like a punch to the gut. My heart skipped a beat, and I had to remind myself to breathe. I listened in stunned silence as Sam's voice continued, filled with a tenderness that seemed far removed from the platonic professionalism I had always imagined between them. "Things haven't been the same since you've been away. I can't wait to see you again. I've been counting the days." I stood there, paralyzed, the phone cold in my hand. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of the peaceful weekend I had been enjoying with the intimate longing expressed in Sam's message. Every word felt like a betrayal, each sentiment a shattering blow to the trust I had placed in Molly. I glanced toward the bathroom, where I could hear the faint sound of water running. Molly was completely unaware of the storm that had just erupted in my mind. How had I been so blind? The once innocent interactions between Molly and Sam now seemed tainted with a layer of deceit I hadn't seen before. I had to keep my composure. The last thing I wanted was for Molly to suspect anything was amiss. I carefully placed her phone back on the nightstand, trying to hide the turmoil that was now boiling inside me. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of betrayal and confusion. The peaceful afternoon I had been enjoying now felt like a distant memory, replaced by the crushing weight of the revelation I had just uncovered. As Molly emerged from the shower, fresh and oblivious, I knew that everything had changed. I had to find out more. I needed to understand the full extent of what was happening before I confronted her. For now, I forced a smile and greeted her as though nothing had happened. But inside, I was already preparing for the confrontation that was inevitably coming. The moments after Molly stepped out of the shower felt surreal. The warm, familiar scent of her body wash filled the room, a stark contrast to the icy shock that had settled in my chest. I had barely managed to mask my inner turmoil, forcing a casual smile as she wrapped herself in a towel and began her usual routine. As she busied herself with getting ready, I excused myself under the pretense of needing to check on something in the office. The truth was, I needed to act quickly. The peaceful facade of our life had been shattered, and I needed to confirm what I had feared. My mind raced with the evidence I had just uncovered. Sam's voice message was a clear indication of something far more intimate than a simple professional relationship. I knew I needed to gather more proof before I could confront Molly. The last thing I wanted was to make accusations without solid evidence. Back in the office, I turned my attention to Molly's phone records. It wasn't difficult to access them. Her password was the same as always, and I had access to her account through our joint billing system. I started sifting through the records, my heart pounding with every click. The phone records confirmed what I had feared. There were numerous calls and messages exchanged between Molly and Sam, some late into the night and others during the times when Molly was supposedly working late. I felt a growing sense of dread as I scrolled through the details, each entry a piece of the puzzle I hadn't wanted to see. Next, I turned my attention to Molly's email and calendar. She had been meticulous about scheduling everything, and her digital notes often included personal plans and appointments. I found several emails and calendar events that hinted at meetings and work-related activities with Sam. One particular entry stood out, a dinner reservation marked as business dinner with Sam, scheduled for a night when Molly had told me she was working late. My hands were shaking as I compiled the evidence. Each piece I uncovered felt like another shard of glass cutting through the fabric of our relationship. I knew I was only scratching the surface, but the weight of what I had found was already overwhelming. With the evidence gathered, I took a moment to compose myself. The house was still eerily quiet. The calm before the storm. I needed to be ready, to have all the facts laid out before me. The confrontation was inevitable, but I wanted to be prepared for the emotional storm it would bring. I returned to the living room, where Molly was now relaxing with a book. She looked up and smiled, her expression so innocently unaware of the upheaval that was brewing beneath the surface. I gave her a warm smile in return, but my mind was a storm of thoughts and plans. The peace of the weekend was gone, replaced by a determination to uncover the full extent of Molly's betrayal. I needed to know everything before I could make any decisions. For now, I would keep my calm and wait for the right moment to confront her. After the whirlwind of discovering the voice message and gathering evidence, I found myself consumed by a singular goal: to uncover the full extent of Molly's relationship with Sam. The peaceful facade of my life was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of betrayal and a relentless need for the truth. The first step was surveillance. I had to see their interactions with my own eyes, to understand the nature of their connection beyond what I'd uncovered through phone records and emails. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. I began by observing Molly's routine more closely. I noted the times she left the house and when she returned, paying particular attention to any patterns or changes. It was clear that her schedule had shifted recently, with more evenings spent out of the house under the guise of work commitments. One evening, I decided to follow her. I waited until she had left, her departure marked by the familiar sound of the front door closing behind her. I followed at a discreet distance, ensuring not to arouse suspicion. My heart pounded as I drove through the city, trying to maintain my focus while my mind raced with possibilities. Molly's destination was a chic, upscale restaurant, one I knew she'd never mentioned before. I parked a few blocks away, ensuring I had a clear view of the entrance. From my vantage point, I watched as Molly entered the restaurant. A short while later, Sam arrived, and I could see him through the large glass windows as he waited for her. I watched them interact with growing unease. Their body language was relaxed and intimate. They exchanged smiles and light touches that spoke volumes more than words ever could. I could see them enjoying each other's company, their conversations animated and filled with laughter. The scene played out with agonizing clarity. They were not merely colleagues meeting for a work dinner, their connection was personal and deeply affectionate. I noted the way Sam's hand rested lightly on Molly's arm, the way they leaned in close to each other. It was a stark contrast to the professional facade they had maintained. I left my spot after an hour, unable to watch any longer. The pain of seeing them together was too much to bear. I drove home in a haze, the images of their interaction replaying in my mind. It was clear that their relationship was far more than a simple affair. It was a full-blown emotional entanglement. Over the next few days, I continued my observations. I followed Molly on several occasions, each time witnessing more of their interactions. I saw them meeting for coffee, spending time together in parks, and sharing moments that were intimate and personal. Each sighting was a painful reminder of the betrayal, but it also provided the clarity I needed. The more I observed, the more I realized how deep their connection ran. Molly and Sam had built something substantial together, something that went beyond casual flirtation. It was a secret world I had been shut out of, a world that now seemed to overshadow everything in my life. The evidence was piling up, and so was my resolve. I knew that the confrontation would be inevitable. For now, I continued to watch from the shadows, documenting their encounters with meticulous detail. I had to be fully prepared for the inevitable moment when I would reveal the truth to Molly and demand answers. The days following my observations were a blur of anger and determination. Each glimpse of Molly and Sam's intimacy fueled a growing sense of betrayal that I couldn't shake. I knew that confronting Molly with the evidence I had gathered would be devastating, but I wanted to ensure my retaliation was precise and impactful. In the quiet moments of reflection, a darker plan began to take shape in my mind. I knew Molly's greatest fear: losing someone she loved to a terminal illness. It was a fear she had shared with me years ago, a personal vulnerability that had been revealed in moments of intimacy. Her former lover, who had been a significant part of her past, was dying of an incurable disease, a fact I had learned from her old conversations and fleeting mentions. The idea of using this knowledge to exact revenge took root. I would craft a plan that would exploit her deepest fears, using the terminal illness of her former lover as a weapon. I knew it was cruel, but in the dark recesses of my mind, it felt like the perfect way to make her feel the full weight of her betrayal. The dim light of my study cast long shadows on the walls as I sat at the desk. The rhythmic clacking of the typewriter keys filling the silence. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding as I meticulously crafted the letter that would serve as the centerpiece of my plan. Each keystroke felt like a deliberate step toward a dark resolution, but I needed this to be executed flawlessly. I knew that this letter had to be more than just a piece of paper with words. It had to be a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. I took great care to ensure that it reflected the depth of Molly's fears and the gravity of her former lover's situation. I had learned from Molly's past conversations that her greatest fear was watching someone she cared about suffer from a terminal illness, and I intended to exploit that fear to its fullest extent. The letter began with a somber and haunting tone. "Dear Molly, I hope this letter finds you, though I know it may be too late. I am writing with a heavy heart, burdened by the weight of my suffering. As you may know, my illness has taken a dire turn. The doctors have informed me that there are no more treatments, no more hopes. I am in the final stages of my life, and the pain is relentless. I have spent my days reflecting on our time together, the moments we shared, and the unfinished business between us. There are so many things left unsaid, and so many regrets I carry. I wish we had had more time to reconcile, to mend the parts of our past that remain unresolved. I know you have your own life now, your commitments. But there is something I need to tell you, something I hope you can understand." Making sure every detail was convincing, I wanted it to evoke a sense of urgency and deep emotional turmoil. The words had to strike the right balance between desperation and nostalgia, forcing Molly to confront her unresolved feelings and fears. With the letter completed, I needed to ensure it reached Molly without any hint of my involvement. I took it to a courier service that specialized in secure, anonymous deliveries. The process was meticulous. I filled out the necessary forms, provided the address, and arranged for the delivery to be made without any trace of its origin. I wanted it to appear as though it had come from a distant, sorrowful place, with no connection to my actions. As the courier left with the letter, I watched from a distance, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and anxiety. The weight of the plan was pressing heavily on my shoulders, and I knew that the fallout from this letter would be significant. The days following the letter's dispatch were filled with tense anticipation. I kept a close watch on Molly, observing her every move with a sense of dread and curiosity. I had to remain calm and supportive, providing comfort while secretly waiting for the storm to hit. The letter arrived on a bright, unsuspecting morning. Molly was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, when the mail came. She glanced through the stack of letters and bills, her eyes landing on the envelope that looked out of place. It was an old-fashioned, cream-colored envelope with no return address. Its simplicity making it seem even more mysterious. Her curiosity piqued, and she opened it with delicate fingers. As she pulled out the letter and began to read, her expression shifted from casual interest to growing concern. The words seemed to leap off the page, each sentence striking her with a growing sense of dread. I watched from the doorway, pretending to be absorbed in the newspaper. My heart raced as I saw her face contort with confusion and then horror. The letter's contents were taking their toll. She clutched it tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, this can't be real." She read the letter over and over, her face growing paler with each pass. The letter's fabricated details about her former lover's terminal illness were having their intended effect. I could see the panic setting in as she began to pace the kitchen, the letter clutched to her chest as if it were a lifeline. Molly's reaction was one of sheer terror. She sank onto a chair, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Her eyes were wide, and her body trembled as if she were caught in a sudden, violent storm. "Why is this happening? Why is he reaching out now?" she muttered to herself, clearly overwhelmed by the emotional weight of the letter. She tried to call someone, anyone who could offer her comfort or answers. Her first call was to a close friend, but her voice was so distraught that the friend could barely understand her. She hung up, her frustration and fear mounting. The letter had hit her hard, and she was struggling to make sense of it. I could see the emotional toll it was taking on her. She wandered from room to room, as if searching for some kind of escape from the crushing reality of the letter. She muttered about regrets and unfinished business, her thoughts racing. Her mind seemed to be caught in a loop of panic and sorrow. The more she read the letter, the more her fear grew. She seemed convinced that the letter was a sign of something terrible. A harbinger of doom linked to her own life. Her former lover's suffering, described in such vivid detail, was now intertwined with her sense of guilt and fear. I offered what comfort I could, maintaining a facade of concern and support. I held her as she cried, whispering soothing words and making sympathetic noises. Inside, however, I was watching with a mix of satisfaction and detachment. The letter was doing its job, unraveling the carefully maintained composure that Molly had always exhibited. As the days went by, the impact of the letter continued to reverberate through Molly's life. She became increasingly withdrawn, her usual routines disrupted by the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. She spoke often about wanting to make amends, to somehow find a way to reconcile with the past and ease the pain of her former lover. I remained a constant presence, offering solace while quietly observing her decline. The letter had planted seeds of doubt and fear in her mind, and now it was up to me to maintain the facade of a supportive husband while preparing for the next steps in my plan. The shock and panic that the letter had induced were only the beginning. The real test would be how Molly would handle the aftermath, and how I could continue to exploit her fears to bring about the resolution I had planned. The days following the arrival of the letter were a tumultuous blur. Molly's initial shock had given way to a pervasive sense of unease that seemed to seep into every aspect of her life. Her once vibrant demeanor had become a shadow of its former self. The letter had cracked her emotional armor wide open, and she was struggling to hold herself together. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic. She would burst into tears at the slightest provocation and seemed perpetually on edge. The once confident and composed woman I knew was now a bundle of nerves, her movements jittery and her gaze haunted. The most noticeable change was in her interactions with me. Molly, usually so independent, now sought my presence constantly. She would cling to me, her fear and desperation palpable. She began to confide in me about her overwhelming guilt and anxiety, revealing just how deeply the letter had affected her. "I can't stop thinking about him," she would say, her voice trembling. "What if it's all true? What if something terrible happens and I'm not there?" I played the role of the supportive husband to perfection. I listened intently, offering comfort and reassurance with a practiced ease. I would hold her, stroke her hair, and offer soothing words designed to calm her nerves. "It's going to be all right, Molly," I'd say gently. "We'll get through this together. We'll find out if there's anything we can do." Inside, however, I was calculating my next moves. The emotional grip I had gained over Molly through the letter was just the beginning. Now, I needed to amplify her feelings of paranoia and doubt, to ensure she remained entirely under my influence. I had to manipulate the situation to maintain control and drive home the sense of guilt and fear she felt. I began subtly sowing seeds of doubt about the people around her. I suggested that her friends and colleagues might not be as trustworthy as they seemed. "Have you noticed how distracted Jane seemed the other day?" I'd ask. "It's almost like she's hiding something. You should be careful who you confide in." I would bring up innocuous conversations and interactions with a slant that made Molly question their intentions. When she would mention a conversation with Sam, I would subtly imply that his actions were more manipulative than genuine. "You know," I'd say, "Sam might be saying those things to keep you unsettled. He might not have your best interests at heart." My goal was to make Molly feel isolated and unsure of who to trust. By creating an environment of paranoia and uncertainty, I could solidify my role as her sole confidant and source of stability. This manipulation would keep her off balance, making her more dependent on me for emotional support and guidance. Her increasing reliance on me was evident. She would frequently turn to me for reassurance, her fear making her more pliable and vulnerable. She would question every interaction and every piece of advice she received from others, and increasingly lean on my support. The emotional manipulation was working. Molly's trust in others eroded, leaving her more reliant on me. I continued to offer the appearance of support, while in reality, I was steering her emotions to suit my agenda. The psychological pressure I was applying was designed to keep her in a state of constant anxiety and doubt, ensuring that when the time came, she would be wholly unprepared for the ultimate confrontation. The plan was unfolding as intended. Molly's emotional vulnerability was growing, and my control over her was tightening. The The stage was set for the final act, where I would reveal the full extent of the deception and the consequences of her actions. For now, I continued to manipulate her feelings, maintaining the illusion of support while orchestrating the next phase of my plan. The days seemed to stretch endlessly, each one marked by Molly's increasing anxiety and emotional turmoil. Despite my best efforts to maintain the facade of support, a small part of me was aware that her doubt was growing. She began to question the authenticity of the letter, though her fear remained a constant companion. It started with small signs. Molly began to reread the letter more critically, her fingers tracing the words as if trying to decipher some hidden truth. She would mutter to herself about inconsistencies, her brows furrowing in concentration. It was clear that she was grappling with the reality of the letter and the impact it had on her. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, Molly brought up the letter in a hesitant tone. "Stephen," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I've been thinking. There's something about the letter that doesn't add up." I looked at her with a carefully constructed expression of concern. "What do you mean, Molly?" I asked, feigning innocence. "It's just the way it's written. It feels so formal, almost too perfect," she explained, her eyes searching mine for answers. "And the details about his illness. Why would he suddenly reach out like this after all these years?" I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was bracing myself. This was the moment when my plan was at risk of unraveling. I needed to navigate this carefully to ensure she didn't piece together the full truth too soon. "Maybe he's just trying to make peace," I suggested, my tone calm and soothing. "Sometimes people act irrationally when they're facing their mortality. It might not make sense to us, but it's his way of reaching out." Molly seemed to waver, but the fear in her eyes was undiminished. Despite her growing doubts, the emotional impact of the letter had left deep scars. She continued to oscillate between skepticism and terror, unable to fully shake the fear that the letter had instilled in her. Over the next few days, her doubt grew more pronounced. She began investigating, reaching out to mutual acquaintances and old contacts, trying to find any confirmation about the letter's claims. The more she dug, the more she became convinced that something was amiss, but the fears still held her captive. One morning, Molly came to me with a new revelation. Her voice was filled with a mix of hope and desperation. "Stephen, I found something," she said. "I talked to someone who knew him recently, and they said he's been in good health. I think the letter might not be real." Her admission was both a relief and a challenge. I had to maintain the appearance of concern while subtly reinforcing her fears. "Are you sure?" I asked, putting on an act of deep concern. It's possible that he was hiding the truth or that the situation changed suddenly. Despite my attempts to deflect her doubts, Molly's mental state had already been severely impacted. The fear and anxiety the letter had caused had taken a significant toll on her well-being. She was exhausted, her face drawn and her eyes haunted. The psychological pressure of not knowing the truth, combined with the emotional strain of the letter, had left her deeply unsettled. One evening, as Molly sat on the edge of the bed, her hands wringing together, she finally voiced her fears aloud. "Even if the letter was fake, I can't stop feeling like I failed somehow," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't believe I let myself get so worked up over something that might not be real." The revelation of the letter's deceit came too late. The damage had already been done. Molly's emotional and mental state was in shambles, leaving her vulnerable and deeply affected. Her realization of the deception only added to her distress, making her question everything she believed in. I watched her struggle, maintaining my guise of a supportive spouse while carefully considering my next move. The ultimate goal of my plan had been to break her down emotionally, and it had succeeded beyond my expectations. Molly was now left grappling with her fears and doubts, her mental state irreparably damaged by the cruel manipulation she had endured. As she lay awake at night, her mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and fear, I knew that the final act of my plan was approaching. The truth of the letter would soon be revealed, but the psychological scars it had left on Molly would be a lasting testament to the depth of my manipulation. The air in our home had grown thick with tension, a heavy silence punctuated only by Molly's occasional outbursts of anguish. Her emotional state was a fragile veneer, barely holding together after the revelations and manipulations I had orchestrated. Now, it was time to deliver the final blow. I had been preparing for this moment with careful precision. The groundwork was laid, and Molly was in a state of emotional ruin. The deceit of the letter had shattered her confidence and trust, leaving her vulnerable and broken. I needed to strike now, to ensure that the impact of my words would be as devastating as the emotional turmoil she had already endured. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I knew it was time to reveal my ultimate decision. The weight of the impending conversation hung heavily between us. Molly's eyes were hollow, her usual spark replaced by a dull, resigned look. "Molly," I began, my voice steady and measured, "there's something we need to talk about." She looked up from her plate, her face pale. "What is it, Stephen?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, her fear and anxiety evident. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I continued, carefully choosing my words to maximize their impact. "About us, about our relationship, and about everything that's happened recently." Molly's hands trembled as she reached for her glass, taking a sip in an attempt to steady herself. "What are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice wavering. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of my words settle before speaking. "I know about the affair, Molly. I've known for some time now. The truth is, I can't continue living like this. The lies, the betrayal, it's too much." Her eyes widened in shock and disbelief. "Stephen, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I'm so sorry," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice cold and unwavering. "I can't be with someone who has deceived me so profoundly. The emotional damage you've caused me is irreparable." Molly's face crumpled, her composure finally breaking. "No, please," she pleaded, her voice choked with desperation. "I know I've made mistakes, but we can work through this. We can fix things." I shook my head slowly, maintaining a firm and unyielding demeanor. "It's too late for that, Molly. The damage has been done. I've already begun the process. There's no turning back now." As she began to cry openly, her sobs filled the room. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "I'm so lost. I didn't realize how much pain this would cause." I watched her with a mixture of cold satisfaction and detached concern. The plan had worked. Molly was shattered, her emotional state laid bare before me. Her pleas and tears were a testament to the depth of her suffering, a direct result of the manipulations I had orchestrated. "I'm sorry, Molly," I said, my voice still firm but laced with a veneer of sympathy. "But this is something I have to do. I can't continue living with this kind of betrayal." As the days progressed, Molly's distress became more pronounced. She was often found sitting alone, her eyes red and her spirit broken. Her once strong presence was now replaced by a person struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the situation. I kept my distance, maintaining the illusion of being an indifferent but supportive partner. I was careful to avoid any actions that might suggest I was reveling in her suffering, but inside, I knew that the final act of my plan had been executed flawlessly. Molly's world was unraveling, and the emotional destruction I had aimed for was complete. The divorce proceedings continued, and as they moved forward, Molly was left to grapple with the aftermath of the betrayal and deceit. The emotional scars she carried would be a lasting reminder of the manipulation she had endured, a testament to the depth of my calculated revenge. The days following my announcement were strangely calm, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Molly. I kept a careful distance, observing her from the sidelines as her world began to unravel. It was almost fascinating to watch her struggle with the emotional fallout of my carefully orchestrated plan. I had anticipated her reaction, but the depth of her emotional response was something I hadn't fully prepared for. It became evident that the realization of the betrayal was hitting her harder than I had imagined. Her initial shock was giving way to a profound sense of despair and confusion. One evening, I found myself lingering near the door of our bedroom, listening to the muffled sounds of Molly's distress. She was on the phone with a friend, and from snippets of the conversation, I could tell that she was beginning to question the truth of everything that had happened. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I could sense that she was on the verge of uncovering the full extent of my manipulation. Later that night, I watched as she sat in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by scattered papers and old documents. Her face was a mask of concentrated anguish as she pored over everything, her eyes darting between the documents and her phone. I knew she was connecting the dots, realizing the grand scheme I had set in motion. The moment she comprehended the full scope of my plan was almost palpable. She collapsed onto the floor, her body shaking with the intensity of her emotions. The realization that I had been behind the entire deception seemed to hit her with the force of a freight train. I watched her, a mixture of detachment and satisfaction coursing through me. This was the culmination of my plan, and I couldn't help but feel a cold satisfaction at seeing it all come together. Her distress was evident as she struggled to come to terms with the betrayal. Her breathing was ragged, and tears streamed down her face. I could hear her whispering to herself, trying to make sense of what had happened. "How could he do this to me?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "How could I have been so blind?" The psychological impact on Molly was severe. I could see her mental state deteriorating as she grappled with the enormity of her realization. Her once strong demeanor was replaced by a fragile, trembling presence. Panic attacks became more frequent, and she seemed to be haunted by nightmares and intrusive thoughts. She eventually sought help from a therapist. From what I could gather, her sessions were intense and filled with raw emotion. She spoke of the letter, the emotional breakdown, and her growing suspicion of my deceit. It was a delicate balance, watching her struggle to piece her life back together while maintaining the facade of being a concerned spouse. Her sessions seemed to provide some relief, a small measure of control in the chaos that enveloped her. She began to make strides toward understanding her pain and finding ways to cope with the trauma. Despite the progress, the process was slow and fraught with difficulty. Molly's attempts to rebuild her life were marked by both determination and lingering distress. The realization of the betrayal had left deep emotional scars, but she seemed resolute in her efforts to heal and reclaim her sense of self. In the midst of all this, I maintained my role with a careful balance. I continued to offer the appearance of support, even as I observed from the periphery. Molly's journey was a testament to the effectiveness of my manipulation, but it was also a stark reminder of the human cost of such schemes. The final stages of my plan were unfolding as intended. Molly's emotional state was precarious, but she was beginning to take steps toward recovery. Her path to healing would be long and arduous, but I had achieved what I set out to do, to dismantle her life and test the limits of her resilience. The final stages of the divorce were as cold and methodical as the rest of my plan. The legal proceedings dragged on, each day further stripping away the remnants of our life together. Every document signed, every court appearance, felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place, sealing the fate of our marriage. Molly's emotional state continued to deteriorate as the process unfolded. She appeared increasingly disheveled and withdrawn. The once vibrant woman I had known was now a shadow of her former self, her confidence shattered by the layers of manipulation and betrayal she had endured. Throughout the proceedings, I maintained a facade of professionalism and calm. I attended meetings and signed documents with a detachment that masked the satisfaction I felt. Each step in the process was a reminder of the control I had exerted over her life, a chilling confirmation of the effectiveness of my plan. The day the divorce was finalized was marked by an eerie stillness. Molly, still grappling with her emotional fallout, seemed to accept the inevitable with a resigned silence. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, I watched her from a distance, noting the hollow look in her eyes. In the aftermath, I was left with a stark sense of cold satisfaction. The vengeance I had sought was complete, but it came with a heavy cost. I had orchestrated a campaign of psychological warfare that left Molly deeply scarred and emotionally drained. Her life was in disarray, and the person I had once shared a future with was now struggling to rebuild from the ruins I had created. As I reflected on the entire ordeal, I found myself contemplating the lengths to which I had gone for the sake of revenge. The meticulous planning, the manipulation, the deceit, everything had been calculated to achieve a single goal. But as I looked back, the satisfaction of revenge was tempered by a deeper reflection on the price of my actions. I had succeeded in dismantling Molly's life, but the process had left me questioning my values and the extent of my moral compass. The lines between justice and cruelty had blurred, and I found myself confronting the reality of what I had sacrificed to achieve my objectives. The cost was not only measured in the emotional and psychological toll on Molly but also in the personal sacrifice of my integrity. I had sacrificed a part of myself in the pursuit of vengeance, and the reflection on that cost was a sobering reminder of the complexities of human emotion and morality. In the end, as I closed this chapter of my life, I was left with a hollow sense of victory. The price of my actions had been steep, and the road ahead was marked by a deeper understanding of the consequences of my choices. The satisfaction of revenge had come at a great cost, and the realization of that cost was a stark reminder of the moral price of my quest for retribution. As I moved forward, I was left to ponder the true cost of vengeance and the path I had chosen. The reflection on the past, and the consequences of my actions, served as a poignant reminder of the complexity and often painful nature of human decisions and the ramifications they leave in their wake.